Hello boys and girls, this is Mrs. Carpenter. I'm going to start reading a chapter book to you called Mr. Popper's Penguins. It was written by Richard and Florence Atwater. The first chapter is called Stillwater. It was an afternoon in late September in the pleasant little city of Stillwater. Mr. Popper, the house painter, was going home from work. He was carrying his buckets, his ladders, and his boards, so that he had a rather hard time moving around. He was spattered here and there with paint. There were bits of wallpaper clinging to his hair and his whiskers. For that, he seemed kind of like a rather untidy man. The children looked up from their play to smile at him as he passed, and the housewife, seeing him, said, "Oh dear, there goes Mr. Popper. I must remember to ask John to have the house painted over the spring." So here's Mr. Popper going home. Got a lot in his hands. No one knew what went on inside Mr. Popper's head, and no one guessed that he would one day be the most famous person in Stillwater. He was a dreamer. Even when he was busiest smoothing down paste on the wallpaper or painting the outside of the other people's houses, he would forget what he was doing. Once he had painted 3 sides of a kitchen green and the other side yellow. The housewife, instead of being angry and making him do it over, had liked it so well that she asked him to leave it. And all the other housewives, when they saw it, admired it too. So that pretty soon everybody in Stillwater had 2-color kitchens. The reason Mr. Popper was so absent-minded was that he was always dreaming about faraway countries. He had never been out of Stillwater. Not that he was unhappy. He had a nice house, a wife who he loved dearly, and 2 children named Janie and Bill. Still, it would have been nice, he often thought, if he could have seen something of the world before he had settled down with Mrs. Popper. He had never hunted tigers in India, or climbed the peaks of the Himalayas, or dived for the pearls in the South Seas. Above all, he had never seen the poles. That is what he regretted most of all. He had never seen those great, shining, white expanses of ice and snow. How he wished that he had been a scientist instead of a house painter in Stillwater, so that he might have joined some of the great polar expeditions. Since he could not go, he was always thinking about them. Whenever he heard that there was a polar movie in town, he was the first person to get a ticket, and often he would sit through 3 shows. Whenever the town library had a new book about the Arctic or Antarctica or the North Pole or the South Pole, Mr. Popper was the first one to borrow it. Indeed, he had read so much about the polar explorers that he could name all of them and tell you what each one had done. He was quite an authority on the subject. His evenings were the best of time. Then he could sit down in his little house and read about his cold regions at the top and the bottom of the earth. As he read, he could take his little globe that Janie and Bill had given him for Christmas the year before and search out the exact spots that he was reading about. So now, as he made his way through the streets, he was happy because the day was over and because it was the end of September. When he came to the gate of a neat little bungalow at 432 Proudfoot Avenue, he turned in. "Well, my love," he said, setting down his buckets and ladders and boards and kissing Mrs. Popper. "The decorating season is over. I have painted all the kitchens in Stillwater. I have papered all the rooms in the new apartment building on Elm Street. There is no more work until spring, when people want their houses painted." Mrs. Popper sighed. "I sometimes wish you had the kind of work that lasted all year, instead of just from spring until fall," she said. "It'll be very nice to have you home for vacation, of course, but it's a little hard to sweep with a man sitting around reading all day. I could decorate the house for you." "No, indeed," said Mrs. Popper firmly. "Last year you painted the bathroom 4 different times because you had nothing else to do, and I think it's enough of that. But what worries me is the money. I've saved a little, and dare say we can get along as we always do in the winters. No more roast beef, no more ice cream, not even on Sundays." "Shall we have beans every day?" asked Janie and Bill, coming in from the play. "I'm afraid so," said Mrs. Popper. "Anyway, go wash your hands for supper, and Papa, put away the little paints because you won't be needing them for quite a while." So that's chapter 1. Thank you for reading with me. I'll read chapter 2 later.